We do have our Anglo-Saxon expert with us tonight, Mr. Steve Pollington, who's going to give us the backstory on the Sutton Hoo excavation.
So I've called the talk this evening Unlocking the Dragon's Hoard, which is a rather mischievous title. We'll be looking at the man behind the Sutton Hoo dig, the unsung hero of the Sutton Hoo excavations. The story of the Sutton Hoo dig, the greatest archaeological discovery made in these islands, I would argue, is very well known these days, and it's recently been dramatised in the film The Dig, starring Ralph Fiennes, Carey Mulligan, Ken Stott and Lily James. The land at Sutton Hoo, overlooking the River Deben in Suffolk, was owned by Edith and Frank Pretty before World War II. Edith was from a wealthy background in Yorkshire, while Frank was heir to an important Suffolk drapery business and had served with distinction in the First World War. The couple had one son, Robert, born in 1937 when Edith was already 47 years old. Sadly, Frank died 4 years later. Edith, widowed and with a young son, found it hard to accept her loss and started to promote the then fashionable spiritualist cause locally in an attempt to make contact with her departed husband. She came to believe that some humps and hillocks on her estate were haunted by the unquiet spirits of Bronze Age noblemen. Eventually, she decided to investigate. In early 1938, Edith began to set the excavation wheels in motion. On the advice of the Suffolk Institute of Archaeology, then housed in Ipswich Museum, she employed a local freelance archaeological excavator named Basil Brown to undertake the project. Brown was a good choice. He was very familiar with the soils of Suffolk and had been a contracting excavator for local museums for several decades. He had worked on many notable sites, including the Roman remains at Wattsfield and at Sutton. He went everywhere by bike to save money. Brown was a part-time tenant farmer, part-time archaeologist, part-time astronomer, part-time special constable, a polymath of a very particular sort. He volunteered for the Suffolk Royal Army Medical Corps in 1916 because he'd been declared medically unfit for active military service. But Brown was also a remarkable autodidact and was a published author on astronomical subjects. He could read Latin, French, Spanish and German. His down-to-earth manner and strong local accent masked a sharp eye and a keen intellect. On Monday, the 20th of June, 1938, Basil Brown arrived at Sutton Hoo House to set to work. In his diary, he remarked that Mrs. Pretty, as he called her, showed him the mound and that he was rather alarmed by their sizes. She wanted him to open the largest one first because she believed that something special lay buried there. With characteristic caution, Basil advised against digging the largest and most challenging mound, the low-hanging fruit, without first having tackled something more manageable. He saw that a similar feature nearby, the one now called Mound 3, showed signs of having already been disturbed, and he knew that he could determine the best method of excavation without damaging undisturbed archaeology. The local soil is sandy and not suited to erecting permanent earthen structures, but it is good for root vegetables. His results in the summer of 1938 were encouraging. In Mound 3, which had already been opened, there were some items the robbers had missed. Parts of a bone casket, an iron axe, the lid of a bronze jug, and part of a cameo. Brown turned to another tumulus, Mound 2, where he found a quantity of iron rivets, which he came to realise must be from a wooden ship, but they were deposited randomly. This told him that the soil had been disturbed and redeposited, and so this mound was probably already robbed too. A buried ship was already known from the same area, at Snape, Mound 2 yielded a portion of a sword, a blue glass jar, and some metal fragments which suggested that the grave had once been richly furnished. A fourth mound, also robbed, contained the cremated remains of an adult female and a dog, all housed in a bronze bowl. The dating of the ship and its contents could now be reclassified from maybe Viking to definitely early Anglo-Saxon on the basis of the distinctive art style of some of the metal fragments. The lessons Basil learnt in this preliminary work enabled him to tackle the larger project, now known as Mound 1, during the next summer, with the supervised help of Mrs. Pretty's gardener, John Jacobs, and William Spooner, the gamekeeper. Having stripped the turves from the outer surface of the tumulus, Brown dug a trench into the mound from the eastern end and soon began to detect ferrous stains in the sandy soil, arranged regularly in rows, from which he deduced that another ship had been buried here and that it had not been disturbed. He started a second trench from the top of the centre in order not to upset whatever lay undisturbed in the Suffolk earth. Gold on Greute, gold in the earth. Subsequent painstaking work in the centre of the feature revealed the presence of a quantity of gold and other ornaments, at which point it was considered necessary to bring in a team of experts from the British Museum under Charles Phillips. Brown was allowed to continue working on the site, but the excavation of the great wealth of treasures was undertaken by Phillips's group. Brown's feelings on the matter were not recorded, but it can only have wounded his pride to feel that his extensive experience and detailed local knowledge were to be disregarded. The quantity of material was impressive. Indeed, it was overwhelming, and almost all of a quality not previously seen in Anglo-Saxon archaeology. The evident richness and historical importance of the find meant that the whole team was sworn to secrecy, particularly under the threat of impending invasion from Nazi Germany. Excavation by the small team proceeded apace. The valuable material was removed from the site in moss-filled wooden trays and taken to London, where it rested in an underground tunnel for the next 6 years during the Second World War. After initial assessment, little detailed conservation work took place until the hostilities were over. We then proceed to the discussion of whose hoard this may once have been, because the possible identity of the wealthy Anglian warlord buried in the mound was the subject of much speculation. The name Radwald was soon favourite. He features in the pages of Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum as a leading king of the East Angles who spent some time in Kent, where he was persuaded to accept Christianity around 605 AD. And on his return home, he thought again. Bede hated him, it seems, because he set up an altar to Christ in the same temple where he worshipped his ancestral gods. It was bad enough being a benighted pagan, but to be shown the light of Christian faith and then reject it was unforgivable for the churchman. He also, equally unforgivably, defeated the king of Bede's native Northumbria in a major battle on the River Idle, where the road from Lincoln crosses the river near Bawtry. This was about 617 AD. The ship burial is usually dated to around 625 AD. But in all honesty, we still don't know for sure who was buried in that ship. And it's merely the fact that Bede thought Radwald worth writing about that has preserved his name for us. We can't even be sure that his name was Radwald with an R and not Radwald with an H. There was uncertainty over the rightful possessor of the hoard in the modern world too. Edith Pretty's legal ownership of the finds recovered from her land was established by a treasure trove inquest in September 1939. Her case rested on the law of the time, under which the Crown would automatically receive any items that had been lost or deliberately hidden with the intent to recover them, and the owner or his heirs not traceable. The evidence of some expert witnesses persuaded the coroner that the burial of a 27-metre-long sailing ship must have been a public spectacle, so that would rule out casual loss, and the evidence of contemporary burials showed that items put in the ground were left there with the departed, not recovered. According to some accounts, the story of the ship funeral at the opening of Beowulf was considered pivotal in showing that the treasure was no longer in circulation among mortal men, and thus must now belong to the landowner. We shall return to Beowulf in a moment. The newspapers recorded the verdict under the rubric "The £1 Million Grave," and for context, a rather smart detached house would then have cost a little under £2,000, and the average salary for a professional was around £10 a week. A 7-figure pile of loot was life-changing, to say the least. But Edith Pretty decided that, although the finds were evidently hugely valuable, their cultural and historical importance was such that they should be available to the British public generally, and she therefore donated them to the nation. They're presently displayed in the British Museum, and the Sutton Hoo site is now furnished with an award-winning visitor centre managed by the National Trust, which retells the story of the treasures and their discovery. So what became of Basil? He went on to excavate several more important sites in the county, including West Stow, the settlement which he identified as an Anglo-Saxon village based on the pottery kilns. He continued to live in his small holding in Rickinghall and was still active in Suffolk archaeology for 3 more decades. He died in 1977 at the age of 89, having suffered a heart attack in 1965, and he retired from paid archaeological work, although he continued his private investigations around his home in Suffolk. It's understood that Rupert Bruce Mitford, who led the 1960s excavations at Sutton Hoo, arranged for Basil to receive a modest pension from the Ministry of Works. Sadly, Edith Pretty died from a stroke in 1942, aged 59. She never saw the treasures from her land after conservation, nor the recreation of the iconic war helm, which now stares out from the pages of 1,000 history books. Her bequest to the nation, with its staggering valuation, is still the single most valuable gift ever made to the British Museum. The question remains, in the film, the 2 things that everyone knows about the Sutton Hoo ship are the ship burial, are the ship and the helmet. Why didn't they include the helmet in the film, The Dig? And the reason is that at the time of discovery, it comprised several hundred, mainly iron fragments, plus the corroded remains of the gilded facial elements. You can see the corroded remains there on the left-hand side. And the British Museum's initial reconstruction on the right, the current one on the left. This is the version that we're familiar with today, worn by my friend Paul Mortimer in all his King Radwald-based glory. We had hoped to have Paul here this evening, but time and COVID and the vagaries of the recent weather militated against this. This is the current reconstruction of the helmet based on the best that can be made of the various pieces as they're known to us today. It seems fitting to end the presentation this evening, not with an ending, but with a beginning, the opening fit of Beowulf in the original tongue, and as the king himself might have heard it. What? We gardena in yer dachum, theod kuninga thrum je frunon, hu tha adlingas ellen fremedon. Oft should shaving share than a threatum, monna yum maidum meudus setzla of teach, eizo de erle sith an arrest werth fair shaft funden. Heth as frovre je bad, welks under wolknum, wirthmundum thach, oth that him eichwilch thara umsittendra, over hronrade, hirran schulde, gomban hildan. That was God Kuning. That was a good king. That was God Kuning indeed. It's dank je el, elre je hurnisse. Thank you for your attention.